There is a file sitting on your Windows computer right now. It has been there for years. You have probably never opened it, never been told it existed, and never been shown what it can do. The people who built it work at Microsoft. The company that spent years listening to you complain about Windows 11 already had the answer. They built it themselves. They just never told you. Before we get into what this tool is, I need to show you something specific that will tell you everything you need to know about how Microsoft has been operating for the last several years. Something that happened on a public platform, in plain sight, and that most people completely missed. There is also a story I want to come back to later in this video. It involves a man who spent 2 years paying money every month for software that solved a Windows problem Microsoft had already fixed for free. He just never knew it existed. That story lands in a way that is going to feel very familiar, and I will get to it in a moment. 136,000. That is the number of developers, engineers, and technology professionals who have starred Microsoft's PowerToys repository on GitHub. 136,000 people who found this tool, recognized how important it was, and bookmarked it for reference. That puts PowerToys among the most popular repositories Microsoft has ever published on the entire platform. And yet, if you ask your average Windows user, someone who has been running Windows for 20 years, someone who has paid for every upgrade, someone who sat through every forced update, they have never heard of it. Not once. Because Microsoft has never mentioned it in a Windows setup screen, never promoted it in a system notification, never included it as a default installation. It sits on GitHub and in the Microsoft Store, quietly available, completely invisible to the people who need it most. But the star count is only half the story. Consider what this tool actually does. Windows 11 ships with a window snapping system that many users find limiting and unintuitive. It ships with a file search that consistently frustrates people who need to find anything quickly. It ships with no built-in ochre, meaning you cannot simply copy text from an image or a locked PDF on your screen. It ships with no native way to pin a specific window above everything else. It ships with no batch file renaming tool of any real power. It ships with no system-wide color picker. These are not obscure features. These are things that millions of ordinary people need every day. Microsoft engineers already built the solutions to every single one of those problems, and then they left them on the shelf while devoting enormous resources to marketing an AI assistant that most people still do not know how to use. How did something this useful end up this hidden? That story goes back further than you might expect, and when you understand the history, what Microsoft has done starts to look less like an oversight and a lot more like a pattern. To understand PowerToys, let's go back to November 1996. Windows 95 had just changed the world. Microsoft was at the absolute peak of its cultural power, and a team of engineers inside the company had a problem. They kept building small utilities, clever fixes, and workflow tools to make their own working lives easier. Tools that tested new shell features, tools that solved small daily frustrations, tools that the official Windows team could not ship inside the operating system itself because they were too experimental, too niche, or simply too far outside the formal release schedule. So in November 1996, Microsoft published 15 of those tools as a free download called PowerToys for Windows 95. The name was deliberate. These were toys. Experiments, unofficial but useful. Tweak UI, which let you customize the desktop. Quick Res, which let you change screen resolution instantly. Small things that made a real difference. And over time, some of those tools proved their worth and were folded into Windows itself. Not all of them, but some. That graduation pipeline was always the stated intention behind the project. Then came the gap. PowerToys for Windows XP arrived in the early 2000s and brought another batch of tools. Image Resizer, Power Calculator, Alt-Tab Replacement, more solutions to more real problems. And then, silence. Vista came and went. Windows 7 came and went. Windows 8 came and went. For 14 years, PowerToys simply did not exist. The revival came on the 8th of May 2019. Microsoft announced that PowerToys would return for Windows 10 and this time, it would be open source, published on GitHub, free to use, and free to contribute to under the MIT license. Bryce Lamson, Clint Rutkus, and other members of the developer community helped shape the new version. Fancy Zones was one of the first tools shipped. Power Rename followed. The list grew steadily, and the community grew with it. By the time Windows 11 launched in October 2021, PowerToys had already solved many of the complaints people had about the new operating system. The tools were ready. They were free. They worked. But Microsoft launched Windows 11 without mentioning PowerToys in any meaningful way to ordinary users. And that is when the gap between what Microsoft builds and what Microsoft promotes became impossible to ignore. The moment that crystallized everything came about 2 years later, and it involves a decision made at the top of the company that explains why PowerToys has stayed invisible while something far less useful has consumed billions in marketing resources. In November 2023, Microsoft's chief executive Satya Nadella stood on stage and declared that artificial intelligence would be the defining feature of Windows going forward. Copilot was embedded directly into the Windows 11 taskbar. It was pushed to users through system updates. It was the subject of press releases, keynote addresses, and a marketing campaign that reached hundreds of millions of people. The pitch was simple. Windows was going to get smarter. An AI assistant built right into your operating system would help you do more with less effort. What did not get mentioned in those announcements was that Microsoft was simultaneously continuing to develop PowerToys, a collection of tools that had already been solving real productivity problems for years and was making no effort whatsoever to surface it to the audience that needed it most. Regular Windows users. People not on GitHub. People who do not read technology press releases. The contrast is not a conspiracy. It is something arguably more frustrating. Copilot is a product that generates excitement in boardrooms and investor calls. It represents a strategic direction. It attracts headlines. PowerToys is a collection of tools built by engineers who wanted to fix things that genuinely bothered them about Windows. One of those things gets billions of dollars of attention. The other gets a GitHub README and word of mouth. In the 12 months following the Copilot launch, user complaints about Windows 11 continued. Forum threads about window management frustrations multiplied. Requests for batch renaming tools filled Reddit pages. People paid for third-party applications to do things PowerToys already did for free. The gap between what Microsoft was building and what Microsoft was promoting had never been wider. And that gap has consequences. Real ones. For real people. I said I would come back to one particular story, and this is where it lands. PowerToys did not stay still during this period. While Copilot absorbed the attention, the PowerToys team kept shipping. Fancy Zones, which gives you a fully customizable window layout system, received significant refinements. You can now define exactly where you want your windows to sit on screen, and PowerToys will remember those positions, even across monitor configurations. The limitation of Windows 11's built-in snap system, which forces you into predefined grid positions, disappears entirely. Power Rename became a serious tool for anyone managing large collections of files. You can batch rename hundreds of files at once using search and replace logic. You can change capitalization rules across entire folders. And you can preview exactly what the rename will look like before you commit. The Windows 11 file renaming experience has not meaningfully changed in years. Power Rename renders that frustration irrelevant. Text Extractor arrived as a capability that should frankly exist in the base operating system. Hold a keyboard shortcut, draw a box around any text visible on your screen, inside an image, inside a locked PDF viewer, inside a video, anywhere, and that text is copied to your clipboard. It works without any internet connection. All processing happens locally. No data leaves your machine. This is the kind of feature that, on a Mac, people refer to as a reason they switched. Always on Top lets you pin any window above all others with a single keyboard shortcut. One key press. The window stays pinned until you press it again. No setting buried in a menu. No third-party application required. Keyboard Manager lets you remap any key on your system to anything you choose. If you have a key you never use, and most people have several, you can reassign it entirely. You can also remap keyboard shortcuts on an application-by-application basis, so the same key combination does different things in different programs. Color Picker gives you a system-wide color identification tool available from anywhere on your screen at any moment. Press a keyboard shortcut, hover over any pixel on your display, and it instantly returns the color value in hex, RGB, or half a dozen other formats. Designers, developers, and anyone who works with visual content will recognize immediately how many steps this eliminates. Mouse without borders lets you control up to 4 computers from a single keyboard and mouse, sharing a clipboard and transferring files between machines. If you work with more than one computer, a desktop and a laptop, or a home machine and a work machine, this removes the need for a dedicated switch or a second set of peripherals entirely. Peek lets you preview a file from inside File Explorer without opening it. Select a file and press a shortcut. A preview window appears instantly. Close it and you are back where you were. No application loading, no waiting. For anyone managing large numbers of documents, images, or spreadsheets, the time saved across a working week is not trivial. Command Palette is the newest major addition. Think of it as a control surface for your entire computer accessed through a single keyboard shortcut. You can launch applications, search files, run system commands, switch Fancy Zones layouts, and trigger any other PowerToys function from one place. No mouse required. 30+ utilities in total, actively developed, completely free, and still not installed by default on a single Windows machine. Which brings me to the human cost of all this. Because it is not abstract, and I promised you a specific story, consider what it means at the individual level for a tool this useful to be this invisible. The PowerToys GitHub repository, which is public and freely readable, is filled with user feedback that tells the story clearly. Someone posts that they just discovered Text Extractor after years of taking photographs of their screen and then retyping the text manually. Someone discovers Fancy Zones after paying $35 a year for a third-party window management application that does a nearly identical job. Someone realizes that Power Rename would have saved them the better part of a working day spent manually renaming hundreds of product photos before a client presentation. The pattern repeats thousands of times. One user account that appears in multiple PowerToys community discussions describes a situation that is almost painfully common. He managed a small archive of scanned business documents, hundreds of image files containing text that was not searchable. For 2 years, he used a paid subscription tool to extract that text, spending money every month on software he considered essential. When he eventually discovered Text Extractor inside PowerToys, he described the experience in a public forum post as one of genuine irritation, not at the tool, which he called extraordinary, but at the fact that the solution had been free and available from Microsoft for years while he spent money he did not need to spend. He is not alone, he is representative. The reason this matters is not that people wasted money, though some did. The reason it matters is that the absence of visible, accessible information about PowerToys has a direct effect on how people experience Windows 11. Users who struggle with window management and have never heard of Fancy Zones form a negative opinion of Windows. Users who cannot extract text from an image conclude that Windows cannot do something that other operating systems can. Users who spend time manually renaming files assume that Microsoft has simply not bothered to solve the problem. In every one of those cases, the solution already existed. The tool was already built. It was already free. It was already on the Microsoft Store. No one told them. The most damaging perception gap in Microsoft's consumer business right now may not be about the quality of its products. It may be about the visibility of the ones that actually work. There are legitimate reasons why PowerToys is not installed by default, and they deserve to be stated plainly. PowerToys is designed for what Microsoft calls power users. Not everyone needs Fancy Zones. Not everyone needs Keyboard Manager. Some of these tools, particularly the ones that intercept keyboard input at a system level, can cause unexpected behavior on machines running specialized software or in managed enterprise environments. Microsoft's stated goal, documented in the project's own design documents, is to allow functionality to be designed in a way where the code could eventually migrate back into Windows itself. PowerToys, by this logic, is a testing ground, a proving ground for features before they earn their place in the core operating system. And that argument has historical support. Some of the original Windows 95 PowerToys did exactly that. They started as experiments and ended up in the shell. But the optimistic case for Microsoft has to be weighed against an equally honest accounting of what is not working. 14 years passed between the Windows XP PowerToys and the 2019 revival. Features that proved their worth in the early 2000s did not make it into Vista, or Windows 7, or Windows 8. The graduation pipeline, if it exists, moves very slowly. And in the meantime, users are paying for third-party tools to do things PowerToys already does, forming negative impressions of Windows based on problems that already have solutions. And in some cases, switching to other operating systems because they believe Windows simply cannot do what they need. PowerToys is actively developed, regularly updated, and genuinely respected by everyone who has found it. The star count on GitHub tells you how many people in the developer community already know its value. But Microsoft does not promote it in Windows setup. It does not appear in the first run experience for new users. It is not bundled with any edition of Windows 11. Apple builds utilities like this into macOS and puts them in front of users at setup. The contrast is not flattering for Microsoft. Whether PowerToys eventually becomes a default Windows component, or whether it remains a well-kept secret for the users who happen to find it, says something important about what Microsoft actually values versus what Microsoft builds. And those two things are not always the same. To recap, Microsoft already built the solution to many of the problems that make Windows 11 frustrating. They built it years ago. They have been improving it continuously. And they have never told most of the people who need it. That tool is called PowerToys. It is free. It is open source. It is on the Microsoft Store right now. And if you have never installed it, you have been using a version of Windows 11 with its hands tied behind its back. If Windows shipped with PowerToys enabled by default, millions of people would think Windows 11 was a much better operating system. That is not speculation. That is just the math of what these tools do.